Approximately 60,000 years in the past, as we measure time, those whom we call the Orion group made one attempt to offer information to those of third density. The group used two kinds of technique. One, the thought transfer, or what we may call telepathy. Two, the arrangement of certain stones in order to suggest strong influences of power, this being those of statues and of rock formations in our Pacific areas, as we now call them, and to an extent in our Central American regions, as we now understand them. However, the information did not fall upon the ears of any who were concerned to follow this path to polarity. These statues and rock formations were constructed at a distance by thought, after a scanning of the deep mind, the trunk of the mind tree, looking at the images most likely to cause the experience of awe in the viewer. Picture, if you will, the entities living in such a way that their mind-body-spirit complexes are at what seems to be the mercy of forces which they cannot control. Given a charged entity, such as a statue or a rock formation, charged with nothing but power, it is possible for the free will of those viewing this particular structure or formation to ascribe to this power over those things which cannot be controlled. This, then, has the potential for the further distortion to power over other selves. Nearly all of the stone heads in Easter Island were constructed at a distance by thought. A very few were created in later times, in imitation of original constructs, by entities upon our Earth plane density. It was the fourth density entity which offered this possibility to those of our first major cycle. In South America were fashioned some characteristic statues, some formations of what we call rock, and some formations involving rock and earth. These lines of Nazca are just the faint traces of what used to be. The entire smoothness, as we see this area now, was built up in many places in hills. The time-space continuum has proceeded with wind and weather, as we would say, to erode to a great extent both the somewhat formidable structures of Earth designed at that time and the nature of the surrounding countryside. At the remove of the amount of time-space, which is now our present, it is difficult to perceive that at the time-space 60,000 years ago, the Earth was formed in such a way as to be visibly arranged in powerful structural designs from the vantage point of distant hills. Approximately 3,600 years ago, the group sent an entity of social memory complex to this planetary sphere. At that time, there was a proper calling for their information. When there is a mixed calling, the window effect is much more put into motion by the ways of the densities. The quarantine in this case was, shall we say, not patrolled so closely due to the lack of strong polarity, the windows, thus needing to be very weak in order for penetration. Thus, the group or empire had an emissary in our skies at that time. This emissary was a fiery nature, which was hidden by the nature of cloud in the day. This was to obliterate the questions of those seeing such a vehicle and to make it consonant with these entities' concept of what we may call the creator. After this, information passed on by thought transfer and by the causing of fiery phenomena and other events to appear as being miraculous through the use of thought forms. Although the impression that they had given to those who called them was that these entities were an elite group, that which we know as diaspora occurred, causing much dispersion of these peoples, so that they became an humbler and more honorable breed, less bellicose and more aware of the loving kindness of the one Creator. The creation about them tended towards being somewhat bellicose, somewhat oriented towards the enslavement of others, but they themselves, the target of the Orion group, by means of their genetic superiority weakness, became what we may call the underdogs, thereby letting the feelings of gratitude for their neighbors, their family, and their one Creator begin to heal the feelings of elitism, which led to the distortions of power over others, which had caused their own bellicosity. Those of the empire were not successful in maintaining their presence for long after the approximate 3,000 date in our history and were, perforce, left with the decision to physically leave the skies. The so-called prophets were often given mixed information, but the worst that the Orion group could do was to cause these prophets to speak of doom, as prophecy in those days was the occupation of those who love their fellow beings and wish only to be of service to them and to the Creator. The origin of the Ten Commandments follows the law of negative entities impressing information upon positively oriented mind-body-spirit complexes. The information attempted to copy or ape positivity while retaining negative characteristics. The recipient was one of extreme positivity, called moishi, thus accounting for some of the pseudo-positive characteristics of the information received. This entity was open to the type of information and philosophy of a self-service nature, due to his people's pressure to do specific physical things in the third density planes. This was an intensive, shall we say, battleground between positively oriented forces of confederation origin and negatively oriented sources. The Orion group used the technique of building upon other negatively oriented information and caused the downfall of the one known as Jesus of Nazareth. This information had been given by the Orion entity, who was able to impress the name Yahweh upon our peoples. This information involved many strictures upon behavior and promised power of the third density, service to self nature. These two types of distortions were impressed upon those already oriented to think these thought forms. Since approximately 3,300 years ago in our measurement, this group has constantly been working upon the harvest, just as the confederation. As our harvest approaches, those forces of what we would call light work, according to their call. The ones of Orion have the working only according to their call. This calling is, in actuality, not nearly as great. Thus, due to the way of empowering or squares, there is much resistance to penetration. Yet free will must be maintained, and those desiring negatively oriented information, as we would call it, must then be satisfied by those moving through by the window effect. Many of those UFOs seen in our skies are of the Orion group. They send out messages. Through telepathy, they pass on information and promulgate the philosophy of the law of one, with the distortion of service to self. Some are received by those who are oriented towards service to others. It is entirely possible for the untuned channel, as we call that service, to receive both positive and negative communications. These messages are then altered to be acceptable to those entities, while warning of difficulties ahead. This is the most that self-serving entities can do when faced with those whose wish is to serve others. Many of our so-called contacts among our people have been confused and self-destructive because the channels were oriented towards service to others, but in the desire for proof, were open to the lying information of the Crusaders, who then were able to neutralize the effectiveness of the channel. The contacts, which the group finds most helpful to their cause, are those contacts made with entities whose orientation is towards service to self. In this case, the Crusaders, who do not find it necessary to lie, will simply begin to give the philosophy they are here to give. The information can become technical, just as some in the Confederation, in attempts to aid this planet, in service to others, have provided what we would call technical information. The technology provided by this group is in the form of various means of control or manipulation of others to serve the self. The Crusaders pass on their concepts in two main ways, just as there are two main ways of, shall we say, polarizing towards service to others. There are those mind-body-spirit complexes upon our plane, who do exercises and perform disciplines in order to seek contact with sources of information and power, leading to the opening of the gate to intelligent infinity. There are others whose vibratory complex is such that this gateway is opened, and contact with total service to self, with its primal distortion of manipulation of others, is then afforded with little or no difficulty, no training, and no control. The Orion group has aided the so-called negatively oriented among our mind-body-spirit complexes. In advanced groups, there are rituals and exercises given, and these have been written down, just as the service to others-oriented entities have written down the promulgated philosophy of their teachers. The philosophy concerns the service of manipulating others, that they may experience service towards the other self, thus through this experience becoming able to appreciate service to self. These entities thus would become oriented towards service to self and in turn manipulate, yet others so that they in turn might experience the service towards the other self. The Orion group uses daydreams of hostile or other negative vibratory natures to feed back or strengthen these thought forms. The use of the physical body gratifications to amplify such daydreams could be termed an unusual characteristic, but a method used by Orion entities. They are able to do this only when there is a strong ability on the part of the receiving mind-body-spirit complex towards the perception of thought forms. There are two types of landings by Orion group. In the first, entities among our peoples are taken on their craft and programmed for future use. There are 2 or 3 levels of programming. First, the level that will be discovered by those who do research. Second, a triggering program. Third, a second and most deep triggering program, crystallizing the entity, thereby rendering it lifeless and useful as a kind of beacon. This is a form of landing. The second form is that of landing beneath the Earth's crust, which is entered from water. Again, in the general area of our South American and Caribbean areas, and close to the so-called Northern Pole. The bases of these people are underground. The Orion group uses the physical examination as a means of terrifying the individual and causing it to feel the feelings of an advanced second-density being, such as a laboratory animal. The sexual experiences of some are a subtype of this experience. The intent is to demonstrate the control of the Orion entities over the Terran inhabitant. The most typical approach of Orion entities is to choose what we might call the weaker-minded entity, that it might suggest a greater amount of Orion philosophy to be disseminated. The negative polarization is greatly aided by the subjugation or enslavement of other selves. The potential between 2 negatively polarized entities is such that the entity which enslaves the other or bids the other gains in negative polarity. The entity so bidden or enslaved in serving an other self will necessarily lose negative polarity, although it will gain in desire for further negative polarization. This desire will then tend to create opportunities to regain negative polarity. The 2 most usual types of bidding are 1. The use of perversions of sexual magic. 2. The use of perversions of ritual magic. In each case, the key to success is the purity of the will of the bidder. The concentration upon victory over the servant must be nearly perfect. The calling mechanism is not congruent in the slightest degree with the bidding mechanism. In the calling, the entity which calls is a suppliant neophyte asking for aid in negative understanding, if you may excuse this misnomer. The Orion response increases its negative polarity as it is disseminating the negative philosophy, thereby enslaving or bidding the entity calling. There are instances where some few Orion entities are called by more highly polarized negative entities of our space-time nexus. Then the contact becomes a contest, which is prototypical of negativity. In this contest, the caller will attempt not to ask for aid, but to demand results. Since the third density negatively oriented harvestable entity has at its disposal an incarnative experiential nexus, and since Orion Crusaders are, in a great extent, bound by the first distortion in order to progress, the Orion entity is vulnerable to such bidding if properly done. In this case, the third density entity becomes master, and the Orion Crusader becomes entrapped and can be bid. The percentage of thought and behavior involving service to self must approach 99% in order for a third-density negative entity to be properly configured for such a contest of bidding. This is rare. However, when it has occurred, the Orion entity, or social memory complex involved has experienced loss of negative polarity in proportion to the strength of the bidding third-density entity. Similarly, a mistaken Orion contact with highly polarized positive entities can wreak havoc with Orion troops, unless these crusaders are able to depolarize the entity mistakenly contacted. This occurrence is almost unheard of. Therefore, the Orion group prefers to make physical contact only with the weaker-minded entity. There are no entities of either group walking among us at this time. However, the Crusaders of Orion use two types of entities to do their bidding, shall we say. The first is a thought form type of entity, known to us as the Men in Black, which have some beingness to their makeup. They have certain physical characteristics given them. However, their true vibrational nature is without third-density vibrational characteristics, and therefore, they are able to materialize and dematerialize when necessary. The second, a kind of robot. The robot may look like any other being. It is a construct. You are perhaps able to perceive a construct. If you grabbed the construct and locked him in a closet, it might be kept for a brief period, although these constructs also have an ability to disappear. The programming on these constructs, however, makes it more difficult to remotely control them. You would not be able to grapple with a thought form entity of the Men in Black, as we call it type.